I've been digging graves for nearly 2 decades, and if there's one thing I can tell you, it's that you start to see things that don't add up. At first, it's all just routine: the dirt, the cold mornings, the smell of wet earth. But after a while, it's like you start to notice the cracks, the things that should have been left buried. I've been witness to a lot of things that people would prefer to forget. But there's one job I'll never forget, one grave I'll never shake from my memory. It started on a quiet Thursday morning in a small town cemetery, somewhere in the hills of Kentucky. The cemetery wasn't particularly old, only about 70 years, nothing like those ancient burial grounds that give you chills just by standing near them. It was a typical plot, grassy and neat, the kind of place where locals would come to visit their loved ones. There wasn't anything strange about it, at least, not at first. The paperwork came through a few weeks before, a simple exhumation request. Nothing out of the ordinary. The family claimed they wanted the remains of their grandfather, Edward Marshall, moved to a newer plot in the neighboring cemetery. It wasn't a big deal. We get these kinds of requests often, especially for family reburials. The records listed him as dying in 1965, a natural death. Standard, routine. The morning we were scheduled for the job, the weather was perfect, a soft breeze, the sky clear and bright, as if nature itself didn't want to acknowledge the task at hand. I arrived early, as usual, with 2 younger guys and a funeral director named Tom. Tom was an old-timer, been in the business longer than I've been alive. He had seen it all and always had a way of shaking off the strange things we defined in our line of work. He said it was just part of the gig. We had no idea how wrong that was. We found the plot without issue. The headstone was simple, just the name and dates. Edward Marshall, 1885 to 1965. Nothing fancy, but it was what we found underneath that would haunt me forever. I've dug up hundreds of graves in my time, and you get to know the weight of a coffin pretty well. It's always different depending on the material, whether it's a wooden casket, a steel one, or even a concrete vault, but you can always tell when something's off. The first shovel hit something hard, and the soil was dense, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But it wasn't the weight that got me at first. It was the silence, the way the earth seemed to swallow the sound. Tom gave me a look when we hit something solid. "Not supposed to be this deep, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. The paperwork didn't mention anything about deeper digging. We cleared the dirt away, and that's when we hit the vault. Concrete, about 3 feet by 6 feet, with no markings, no sign of way. I've seen these before, old but sturdy. The vault should have been intact, but when we started lifting the lid, it didn't budge the way it should. It was as though the ground itself was holding it down, resisting. It wasn't until we cracked the vault open that things started to get really strange. Tom leaned in, shining his flashlight over the casket inside. The first thing we noticed was the weight. It was wrong. This was a wooden coffin, supposed to be light, but it felt like we were trying to lift an anchor. Something didn't add up. "Help me with this," Tom muttered, and together we managed to pry the lid open. The body inside was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, just like the records said. His face was preserved, although pale and gaunt, but the strangest thing was his hands. They were clasped over his chest, as though he were in a deep, peaceful sleep. But when I looked closer, I saw his nails had been torn off, his fingers bruised, as if he had been fighting something from inside that box. That wasn't the worst part, not by a long shot. As I looked further down, I noticed something strange at the feet of the body. A thick, black, tar-like substance was seeping from the base of the casket, staining the wood. It wasn't the usual decay you'd expect. No, it looked deliberate. Something was off about the way the body was arranged, the way the tar clung to the corpse. I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. I turned to Tom. His face was ashen. "We need to call this in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But when we went to touch the body again, the entire casket shifted, and something inside it rattled. The tar around the body began to bubble as though it were alive. At that point, I wasn't sure if it was fear or sheer curiosity, but we opened it all the way. Underneath the body, hidden beneath the layers of tar, was something worse. A second coffin, a smaller one, a child's coffin, shoved hastily underneath, with no records, no permission. The child inside was skeletal, covered in old rags. I couldn't place the gender, the remains were so badly decayed, but I could see that the body had been shoved into that small box, crushed, as if it had been buried alive. The tar began to churn violently, and I knew then that this wasn't just some mistake or oddity. No, someone had gone to great lengths to hide something here. But what? Why? My heart was pounding. my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone to call the authorities. But before I could dial, I heard it. A faint whisper, like a voice coming from deep beneath the ground, barely audible over the crackle of the phone's speaker. "Help me." I dropped the phone, my skin crawling. Tom was already backing away, muttering under his breath. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. The wind had stopped completely. No birds, no movement. Just that whispering voice, coming from nowhere. We didn't finish the job that day. The police arrived shortly after, and the authorities took over. They closed the site off, took the bodies for further examination, and started an investigation. The coroner's report later confirmed the worst. The child's body had been buried alive, but the records didn't explain the tar or why it had been there at all. No one ever found out what had truly happened in that grave. As for me, I didn't dig another grave for months. The images of that coffin, the tar, the child's broken body, they stayed with me, haunting every waking moment. And the voice, always just at the edge of hearing, it followed me, gnawed at me from the inside out. I still work in the business, of course, but I never look at a plot the same way. Some graves hold more than bones, some hold secrets too terrible to imagine, and once you start digging, it's hard to stop wondering what you might find beneath the surface. I learned that lesson the hard way. Now, every time I dig, I can hear that voice again, whispering from the depths. "Help me." I've been digging graves for almost 15 years now. Most people don't know the half of it, the things that happen in the silence of a cemetery, where the only witnesses to your work are the dead and the earth itself. But I've seen things that don't belong in the ground, things that keep you up at night long after the job is done. It started a few years ago, during the fall. The cemetery was small, on the edge of town, and not many people visited. The ones who did came from old families, the kind who paid their respects and left. Nothing fancy, but this one was different. The paperwork said we were exhuming a body for a family who wanted to move their deceased relative, a man named Charles Bryant, to a family plot further away. That kind of thing happens, so it didn't raise any red flags. It was a routine request. The man had passed away in the early 70s, heart attack, the record said. Not unusual. We were scheduled for the dig in the afternoon. I arrived early with my crew. The place was quiet, as it always was, the only sound being the wind stirring the leaves. It was an old cemetery, with crooked gravestones and ivy curling over the gates. It felt like something ancient was buried here, and not just the dead. As I made my way to the plot, I saw the headstone. Charles Bryant, 1940 to 1973. A simple grave, no frills. The first shovel strike felt off. The dirt was soft, but heavier than it should have been. It wasn't the kind of dirt you find in a grave. It was dense, almost like clay. The kind of dirt that sticks to your shovel and resists every turn. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe the ground had been compacted over the years. But as we dug deeper, things started to get weird. The deeper we went, the stranger the soil became. It was almost as if the earth itself had swallowed something. We reached the vault by mid, and that's when I noticed something odd. The vault wasn't where the paperwork said it should be. It was off-center, closer to the edge of the plot than I'd ever seen. A simple mistake, maybe, but it set my nerves on edge. We tried to lift the vault, but it was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. At first, I thought maybe it was waterlogged, so we worked in teams to shift it. But no, this was something else. The concrete was dense, too heavy for a typical casket. After several attempts, we finally cracked the lid open. I can even explain the chill that ran down my spine when I saw what was inside. The body, well, it wasn't quite a body. It was a man, dressed in what looked like a uniform, but the body had been mummified, dried out completely, like the skin had shriveled and hardened into a brittle shell. His face was gaunt, hollow eyes staring into nothingness, and his hands were stiff at his sides, fingers curled as if gripping something tightly. But that wasn't the worst part. At the feet of the corpse, wedged beneath the body, was a bundle, a small, tightly wrapped package. It didn't belong. No one had mentioned anything about a second burial, and there was no record of any child being buried there with him. I felt my stomach drop as I approached the bundle, my hands trembling as I unwrapped it. Inside was the skeletal remains of a child, barely larger than a doll. But this wasn't just any child. This child had been buried in a casket with the man, but no one had ever spoken of this child. No one had asked for a second burial. I called out to the funeral director, but there was no answer. The silence of the cemetery had grown heavy, oppressive. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the casket. I needed to find the funeral director to figure out what was going on, but when I turned around, he was gone. The entire site felt eerily empty, like we were the only ones left in the world. I had to call the authorities, of course. It was protocol. But when the police arrived, everything seemed off. They were confused. No one had a record of a second burial. No one could explain why the child's remains were in that casket. The funeral home's records were clear. Charles Bryant had been buried alone, in a simple wooden casket, just as the paperwork said. But that child, that tiny body, hidden beneath the man's decayed corpse, seemed to tell a different story. The medical examiner's report confirmed it. There was no evidence that the child had died of natural causes. No medical records. The child had been murdered. But by whom? Why? I didn't stick around to find out. After the police took over, I left the cemetery feeling like the ground itself was watching me. I had worked graves my whole life, but nothing had ever felt like this. Weeks passed, and the investigation dragged on. The police uncovered a dark secret. The man buried there, Charles Bryant, wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was Daniel Cole, a fugitive wanted for a string of child disappearances in the 1960s. The child in the casket wasn't his son. No, it was one of his victims. A child he had taken and buried, hidden away with him, where no one would ever find them. I don't know what happened to Daniel Cole or whatever his real name was. The investigation went cold after a few months, and the case was eventually closed. The cemetery where the grave had been dug. It's still there, untouched, like nothing ever happened. But I can't shake the feeling that the ground knows what happened. Every time I pass by that cemetery, I can't help but feel the weight of it, like something is buried there that doesn't belong. The voices in the wind have changed since that day, and sometimes, just as the sun sets, I can hear something whispering from the earth. It sounds like a child crying for help, a voice calling out, lost and unheard. I've been digging graves for a long time, and I've seen things that should have stayed buried, but I've never heard a voice like that before. And I know, deep down, that whatever happened at that cemetery, it's still there, waiting, buried beneath the dirt. Some graves never rest. Some graves are waiting for you to uncover their secrets, and I swear one day I'll be back there. I've always been the kind of guy who keeps his head down and gets the job done. You don't last long in this line of work if you read the type to ask too many questions. You learn early that digging graves isn't about curiosity, it's about routine. Every day is the same shovel, the dirt, crack open the casket, move the body, and bury it again. That's how it's supposed to go, at least. But I'll tell you right now, there's a reason I don't sleep well anymore. Some graves have a way of never letting you go. It started one spring morning in 2003. The job seemed simple enough at first. A routine exhumation for a family who wanted to move their deceased father to another cemetery. His name was Frank Dover, a man who passed away in 1979 from complications related to his heart. At least, that's what the paperwork said. Nothing about it struck me as odd. People move bodies all the time. The family was wealthy, so the paperwork was all in order, permits, authorization, everything. We showed up early, the sky just beginning to brighten as we rolled our equipment to the graveyard. This one was out in a rural town, surrounded by farmland. The cemetery wasn't much, just a few dozen graves. A quiet, peaceful place, the kind that didn't get a lot of foot traffic. I remember how still it was that morning, like the air was thick with something unspoken. I'd worked here before, so I knew the plot. Frank's grave was near the back of the cemetery, marked by a large marble stone that read simply, Frank Dover, 1925 a 1979. We started digging without issue. The earth soft, but not too hard to break through. It took a little longer than usual, but nothing that raised any alarms. We finally hit the vault, a concrete one that looked standard for the 70s, nothing out of the ordinary. That's when things began to feel off. As we tried to lift the vault lid, something about the weight didn't feel right. It was heavier than it should have been. At first I thought it might have been waterlogged or had some buildup of decay, but it didn't make sense. This was a concrete vault, sealed tight. We had to strain to lift the lid, and when we cracked it open, that's when I saw it. The body inside wasn't Frank's. The corpse was a woman, a skeletal figure with dark matted hair, her clothes discolored and torn. The stench was unbearable, even after all those years underground. I thought I might pass out right then and there. I could hear the guys behind me muttering, but I couldn't take my eyes off the body. The funeral director was with us, his face paling as he leaned in to inspect the remains. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered. I couldn't answer. I was too busy trying to make sense of it. The body was definitely a woman, but it didn't belong here. We double-checked the paperwork, the records. Frank Dover was supposed to be in this grave. But this wasn't Frank. I'll be honest with you, I had no idea what to do. I called the police, of course, but by the time they arrived, the atmosphere at that cemetery had changed. It felt colder, like the earth itself was pressing down on us, holding its breath. The police and the coroner arrived, and after what felt like hours of paperwork and questions, they decided to dig further. It was protocol. But even then, I knew we weren't just looking at a simple mistake. They cracked the vault open further, and that's when we saw the second surprise. At the woman's feet, there was another body. A child, wrapped in what looked like tattered rags, tucked in tight. I froze when I saw it. I couldn't breathe. Who was burying children in a man's grave? But it didn't stop there. As we carefully removed the child's remains, the officer found something else, something metallic. A small rusted key was wedged between the ribs of the child. It didn't belong there. No one had mentioned anything about this key. The officers turned it over in their hands, but there was no explanation for it. No one knew where it came from, why it was there, or who the woman and child were. The police thought it might be linked to some kind of organized crime, considering the oddity of it all. But as the investigation deepened, they uncovered something much darker. It turns out Frank Dover wasn't who he said he was. He wasn't even Frank Dover. His real name was Thomas Hyde, a man who'd disappeared in 1965 under mysterious circumstances. There were no records of him dying in 1979. In fact, there were no records of him dying at all. But what we did find were rumors of a man who had been part of something unspeakable, involved in trafficking, in black market adoptions. The woman, her name was Evelyn Hart, a woman who'd gone missing in the early 60s, presumed dead. The child, a girl named Sarah, who had vanished without a trace shortly before Thomas Hyde or Frank Dover had died. When the police checked records, they discovered that the key we found was linked to an old storage unit on the outskirts of town. After further investigation, they uncovered a room full of sealed boxes full of children's toys, personal belongings, and letters. There were no birth certificates, no official records, just personal mementos from families who had no idea what had happened to their loved ones. But here's the thing that still haunts me. The woman and child weren't the only ones. There were more bodies, hidden under false names, buried in plain sight. We uncovered dozens of them over the following weeks. Children, women, and men, all buried with false identities, their graves swapped, mixed up in places they shouldn't be. It became clear that Thomas Hyde Frank Dover had been hiding people, erasing their existence, burying them in unmarked graves, swapping identities. No one knew who had authorized the burials or why, but those graves weren't meant to be found. I wish I could tell you that everything was solved, that the truth came out and the case was closed, but that's not how it ended. The cemetery was shut down, the bodies were moved, but I never heard a word after that. They sealed the records, and the graves were emptied, each one erased from the public eye. But I can tell you this, the night before they closed the cemetery for good, I went back. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I stood there, looking over the graves, and I swear I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't just the wind, no, it was something else, something buried there, waiting to be remembered. I don't go back to that town anymore. I don't work in cemeteries anymore. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that whisper, the voices of the ones who were buried, the ones who were forgotten, and I know they're still down there, hidden in the earth, waiting for someone to remember, someone like me. Some graves should never be disturbed, and some truths should stay buried. I've been digging graves for a long time now, and after years of burying the dead, you start to notice things, small things that most people would never think about, like how the dirt feels, the weight of a coffin, or the silence that fills a cemetery when the sun is setting. But there's one grave that I can never forget, one job that has kept me awake at night ever since. It happened back in 2007. I was working at a small cemetery near the edge of town, a place that hadn't seen much action in years. The town was quiet, the cemetery even quieter. Most of the headstones were worn with age, the names faded from years of sun and rain. Not much happened here. But that morning when I arrived to start my shift, something felt off. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the paperwork came through. The exhumation request was from a family who wanted to move their loved one, a man named Joseph Reed, to a different plot. The paperwork was all in order, signed by the right people, with all the proper permits. Joseph had died in 1964, the record said, a heart attack, nothing unusual. It was a simple job dig, lift the casket, move it to a new location, no big deal. The grave was in the oldest section of the cemetery near the back, next to a row of large oak trees that had seen better days. I arrived early, like always, and began preparing the site. The ground was soft, but not too soft. It didn't take long to get down to the vault, but that's where things started to get strange. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Now, I've dug hundreds of graves in my time, and the smell of decay is something you get used to. But this wasn't that. It was something sour, almost metallic, like something had been buried there that shouldn't have been. But I shook it off, thinking it was just the age of the grave, the dampness of the soil. When we hit the concrete vault, we tried to lift it, but it didn't move the way it should have. It was heavier than it was supposed to be. We'd lifted concrete vaults before, so we knew how it should feel. This one didn't feel right. It was dense, like it had absorbed something heavy over the years. It wasn't here until we finally cracked open the lid that I realized just how wrong everything was. The body inside was Joseph Reed, or at least, it looked like him. His face was pale, and his suit was discolored with age. But there was something off. His hands were folded neatly on his chest, but they were clenched. His fingers were curled, almost as if he was holding something tightly. That's when I noticed it. At the base of the casket, underneath the body, was a small metal box. I didn't recognize it at first, but I could see it had been wedged into the corner, hidden from view. I didn't want to touch it, but I felt like I had to. Something told me that box wasn't supposed to be there. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat, and when I touched it, I felt a shock, like static electricity running up my arm. I pulled it out carefully. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, rusted and old. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside was a bundle of cloth, wrapped tightly. I unwrapped it, and what I found inside made my stomach turn. A woman's hand severed at the wrist. I froze. The hand was old, decayed, but still somehow recognizable. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to find in a grave. It was like someone had taken the hand of a woman, wrapped it up, and buried it with Joseph Reed. There were no records of any woman being buried with him, no mention of a woman in the papers, no family members listed. Just Joseph Reed, and this hand. I called the funeral director, who showed up a short time later, and even he was taken aback. He called the police, and when they arrived, things started to get even stranger. The hand, as it turned out, wasn't the only thing that had been buried with Joseph Reed. The police found more underneath the casket. Hidden in the vault were other parts. A foot, a piece of an arm, and buried beneath the body, a small, charred skull, barely recognizable. But there was one thing that stood out to me more than anything else. Every part that had been buried with Joseph Reed had a small metal clasp attached to it, a clasp that seemed to be tied to a larger chain, which led to something even darker. The police found out that the man who had been buried in that grave was not Joseph Reed. His real name was Thomas Ward, and he had disappeared from the area in the late 1950s. The pieces of the woman's body and the other remains were identified as people who had been missing over the years. Some had been gone for decades. The skull that belonged to a woman named Emily Scott, a local school teacher who had vanished in 1954. Her family had never gotten any answers. It turned out that Thomas Ward Joseph Reed, as he'd called himself, was a man with a dark past. He had been involved in some kind of twisted ritual, one that involved the collection of body parts. He'd been hiding them, burying them with himself, in the hopes of, what? Immortality. Some sort of unholy power. No one could say for sure. But the discovery of his grave, and the remains buried with him, sent ripples through the town. The police investigated further, but they never found out how many people had been involved, or how long Thomas Ward had been collecting his victims. The records were gone. The answers buried with the dead. I don't know what happened to the remains. The authorities took them, and I never heard the outcome of their investigation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery held more secrets, things that hadn't been uncovered. I left the job soon after. I couldn't go back there, not after what I'd seen. But it stays with me, that feeling like something is still buried beneath the earth, waiting for someone to uncover it. And sometimes, when I drive by that cemetery, I can feel it, that weight in the air, like the ground is holding its breath, waiting for someone to ask the wrong question, to dig in the wrong spot. Some graves should never be disturbed. Some secrets were never meant to be found, but sometimes they are, and when they are, they don't let you forget them. I've spent years working as a gravedigger, and I've seen things that would make most people run in the opposite direction. I've seen what happens when people try to hide their secrets in the ground, thinking the earth will keep them safe. But I can tell you this, there are some graves that the earth won't hold on to, and there are some things buried beneath the soil that you never want to uncover. It was 2010, and the job was supposed to be simple. A routine exhumation. A woman named Carol Hampton had passed away in 1992, and her family wanted to move her remains to a larger family plot across town. The paperwork was standard, everything lined up. The request came from the daughter, who had been out of town when her mother was originally buried. Now, years later, she wanted her mother to rest with the rest of the family. I didn't think much of it. These kinds of jobs come through every year. The cemetery wasn't large, a small community plot with weathered stones and fading inscriptions. It had been around for nearly a century, and the place was quiet, even on the busiest days. Carol's grave was in the far back corner, near the old church. It was a peaceful spot, nestled beneath the shadow of a tall oak tree. When I arrived that morning, the sun was still low, casting long shadows over the rows of graves. There was something about the place that felt heavy, like the earth had been sitting too long without a breath. The ground was soft, as it usually is in this part of the country, and the digging didn't take long. But even from the start, there was something off. I can't explain it, but the soil didn't feel right. It was almost as though it had been tampered with. I shook it off, thinking it was just the nerves of the job, but I knew deep down that something wasn't quite right. By the time we reached the vault, I could tell we were going deeper than we should have. The casket was supposed to be a standard one, nothing special. But the vault didn't look quite like the others I had worked with. It was old, rusted, and there was an odd, almost pungent smell coming from it. When we tried to lift the lid, the weight felt wrong. It wasn't heavy in the way a waterlogged casket should be. It was more like it had been sealed too tight, like it hadn't been opened in far too long. We finally cracked the lid open, and that's when everything went sideways. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but what I saw made my stomach drop. The body inside wasn't what I expected. The woman inside, Carol Hampton, wasn't the person I'd imagined. She wasn't decayed like she should have been after nearly 2 decades in the ground. No, she looked well preserved, as though she'd just been laid down to rest yesterday. Her skin was pale, but it wasn't decomposing. It looked smooth, unnaturally so. Her hair was still intact, and there was no sign of the usual mummification or rot you'd expect after so many years. But there was something else. Her eyes were open. It's hard to explain what I felt when I saw that. It wasn't just the shock of finding a body that shouldn't look so intact. No, it was the way her eyes seemed to stare directly at me. Her pupils were dilated, almost like she had been awake all this time. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the body. I didn't want to, not with those eyes looking at me. My assistant, Mark, was the one to get closer, his voice trembling as he called me over. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked, his eyes wide. We examined the body more closely, and that's when we found something that made my heart race. Wrapped tightly in her hands was a small, worn-out notebook. It was covered in dirt, but the pages inside were still legible. Mark flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few lines. His voice barely audible, he read out loud. August 16th, 1992. I can feel it coming. The earth is waiting for me. I can't stop it. No matter how hard I try, I'll be free. I'll never be buried. I'll never die. I froze. That wasn't normal. It didn't make sense. Why would she write something like that? And why, after all these years, was her body still intact? There had to be some explanation, but it didn't make sense. We both felt the temperature drop around us, the air thickening like a storm was about to hit. Then came the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. Soft, low, like someone was speaking right behind me. "Help me, please." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just Mark, standing there, looking as terrified as I felt. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my hands starting to sweat. I turned back to the casket, but the whisper continued, getting louder, more insistent. I couldn't breathe. The words from the notebook were echoing in my mind. "I'll never die." The thought lodged itself in my brain like a nail, and I couldn't shake it. We finished the job as quickly as we could, lifting the body with great care, but neither of us spoke much. We placed the remains in the new plot, but neither of us felt safe leaving her there. The whispers hadn't stopped, even as we covered the grave. It felt like Carol Hampton, or whatever was left of her, was still there, watching, waiting. The family was happy with the move. They never questioned why the body was still in such perfect condition. They didn't know about the notebook or the whispers. They didn't know what we found buried with their mother. I've been working this job for years, but I don't think I'll ever forget that day. It's been months since that exhumation, but sometimes, late at night, I can hear it again, the whisper, soft and insistent, calling to me from the earth. Help me. I don't know what happened with Carol Hampton. Maybe she wasn't supposed to die that day. Maybe she was waiting, buried alive, for someone to dig her up. I don't know if the notebook was a warning or a plea for help. But one thing's for sure, some graves shouldn't be opened. Some secrets should stay buried. And some voices, once you hear them, never let you go. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.